When I was 19 years old, I took a job as a winter caretaker at a remote research station just outside of Barrow, Alaska, now known as Utqiagvik. This was back in November of 2019, right as the polar night was beginning. For those who do not know, the polar night is a phenomenon where the sun does not rise above the horizon for over 60 days. The darkness is absolute, broken only by the occasional flicker of the aurora borealis or the dim glow of artificial lights. I thought I was prepared for the isolation and the cold. I thought I understood what I was signing up for. I was wrong. The research station was a collection of prefabricated buildings connected by enclosed walkways situated about 12 miles from the nearest village. My job was simple enough: monitor equipment, perform basic maintenance, keep the generators running, and make sure nothing froze over. There were supposed to be 2 other caretakers with me, but one backed out at the last minute due to a family emergency, and the other never showed up. No explanation was given. So it was just me, alone in the darkness, with only a satellite phone for emergencies and a radio that crackled with static more often than it transmitted actual voices. The first week was manageable. I kept myself busy during the day, though calling it day felt strange when there was no sunlight to mark its passage. I relied on my watch and the schedule I had taped to the wall of my quarters. I ate at regular intervals. I exercised. I read books. And I tried to keep my mind occupied. But the silence was oppressive. There was no wind most days, no animals, no distant hum of civilization. Just silence, thick and heavy, pressing in from all sides. It was on the 8th night that I first noticed something was wrong. I was performing my evening rounds, checking the equipment in Building C, which housed the meteorological instruments. As I walked down the narrow corridor, I heard a sound that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was a voice, faint and muffled, coming from somewhere deeper in the building. At first, I thought it might be the radio picking up a stray signal, but the radio was back in the main building. I stood there, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and I listened. The voice was speaking, but I could not make out the words. It sounded like someone was having a conversation, their tone rising and falling in a natural rhythm. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but the voice stopped immediately. The silence that followed was even more unsettling than the sound itself. I searched every room in Building C, checking closets, storage areas, even the cramped space beneath the stairs. There was no one. I told myself it was my imagination, that the isolation was already getting to me, but deep down I knew what I had heard. Someone, or something, had been in that building with me. The next few nights were quiet, and I started to relax. I convinced myself that it had been a one-time occurrence, maybe a trick of the acoustics, or the wind finding a way through a crack in the walls. But then, on the 12th night, it happened again. This time, I was in the main building, sitting at the small desk in my quarters, writing an email to my family. The lights flickered, which was not unusual given the temperamental generators. But then I heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from the corridor just outside my door. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, and I listened. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I could see the shadow of someone standing there, blocking the thin strip of light that came through the gap at the bottom of the door. I do not know how long I sat there, staring at that shadow, my heart pounding in my chest. It felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. Finally, I found the courage to stand up and open the door. The corridor was empty. There was no one there, no sign that anyone had been there. But the air was cold, colder than it should have been, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me, even though the heating system was running. Over the following days, the occurrences became more frequent and more intense. I would hear voices in empty rooms, whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I would see shadows moving in my peripheral vision, always just out of sight. Objects would be moved when I was not looking. A wrench I had left on a workbench would be on the floor. A door I had closed would be open. A chair would be turned around, facing the wall. I started keeping a log of everything that happened, writing down the times and descriptions, hoping that seeing it all laid out would help me make sense of it. But the log only made things worse. The pattern was undeniable. Something was in the station with me. The worst incident happened on the 23rd night. I was woken up by the sound of someone screaming. It was a high-pitched, anguished scream that cut through the silence like a knife. I bolted out of bed, grabbed my flashlight, and ran into the corridor. The scream was coming from Building B, the laboratory. I sprinted down the enclosed walkway, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and I burst through the door into the lab. The scream stopped the moment I entered. The room was empty, but the temperature had dropped so much that frost was forming on the windows. And then I saw it. On the far wall, written in the frost, were 2 words: "Get out." I stood there, staring at those words, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The letters were large and uneven, as if they had been written in haste by someone dragging their finger through the frost. I reached out to touch them, to confirm they were real, but as my hand approached the wall, the frost began to melt. The letters blurred and ran, and within seconds they were gone. I backed out of the room, my legs shaking, and I ran back to my quarters. I locked the door, shoved a chair under the handle, and I sat on my bed clutching the satellite phone. I wanted to call for help, to tell someone what was happening, but what would I say? That I was seeing ghosts, that something was haunting the research station. I knew how that would sound. I would be pulled out, maybe even sent for a psychological evaluation, and I needed this job. I needed the money. So I stayed, even though every instinct was screaming at me to leave. The next morning, I did some research using the station's limited internet connection. I found out that the research station had been built on the site of an old mining camp from the early 1900s. The camp had been abandoned after a series of accidents killed nearly a dozen workers. The details were sparse, but from what I could piece together, the miners had been trapped during a particularly harsh winter. And when rescue teams finally arrived in the spring, they found the bodies frozen in the tunnels. Some of the reports mentioned strange behavior among the miners in the weeks leading up to their deaths. Paranoia, hallucinations, violent outbursts. The doctors at the time attributed it to cabin fever and malnutrition, but reading those accounts, I could not help but wonder if there was more to it. I spent the next few days trying to avoid being alone in any one place for too long. I would move from building to building, constantly checking over my shoulder, always listening for the sound of footsteps or voices. But the presence, whatever it was, seemed to be growing bolder. I would wake up to find things moved in my room. My clothes would be scattered on the floor. My books would be stacked in strange configurations. Once, I woke up to find my flashlight disassembled, the batteries removed, and placed in a neat line on my desk. On the 31st night, I decided I had had enough. I packed my essential belongings, grabbed the satellite phone, and I prepared to make the call to request an early evacuation. But before I could dial, the lights went out. All of them, throughout the entire station. The generators had shut down. I fumbled in the darkness, trying to find my flashlight, and when I finally turned it on, I was not alone. Standing in the corner of my room, barely visible in the dim beam of light, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me. It did not move, did not make a sound, but I could sense its presence, cold and malevolent. I do not remember much of what happened next. I know I ran. I grabbed my coat, my boots, and I ran out into the darkness. The temperature outside was well below freezing, and the wind had picked up, whipping snow into my face. I did not care. I ran toward the village, using my flashlight to guide me, stumbling over the uneven ground, my lungs burning from the cold air. I do not know how long I ran, but eventually I saw lights in the distance. The village. I collapsed at the edge of the settlement, and the next thing I remember is waking up in a small clinic, wrapped in blankets, with a doctor asking me what had happened. I told them the generators had failed, and I had panicked. I did not mention the voices, the shadows, or the figure in my room. They airlifted me out the next day, and I never went back to the station. I heard later that they sent a team to investigate the generator failure, and they found nothing wrong. The generators were running fine when they arrived. They also found my log, the one where I had documented everything that had happened. They asked me about it, and I told them it was fiction, something I had been writing to pass the time. I do not think they believed me, but they did not push the issue. I am 24 now, and I still think about those 31 days in the darkness. I have tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that it was just isolation and stress playing tricks on my mind. But I know what I saw, I know what I heard. There was something in that research station, something that did not want me there. And to this day, I cannot stand to be in complete darkness. I sleep with the lights on, and I avoid going anywhere remote or isolated, because I know, deep down, that whatever I encountered out there in the polar night is still waiting in the darkness, and I have no intention of ever going back. When I was 22 years old, I spent the winter months at my family's cabin outside of Fairbanks, Alaska. This was in January of 2021, right in the middle of the polar night season when daylight was scarce and the temperature regularly dropped to 30 below zero. My parents had inherited the cabin from my grandmother, and it had been sitting empty for almost 2 years. They asked me to spend a few months there to make sure everything was in working order and to keep an eye on the property. I had just finished college and did not have any immediate job prospects, so I agreed. I thought it would be peaceful, a chance to clear my head and figure out what I wanted to do with my life. I had no idea what I was walking into. The cabin was about 15 miles outside of Fairbanks, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that was barely maintained in the winter. The nearest neighbor was about 3 miles away, an older man named Mr. Peterson, who had lived in the area for decades. When I first arrived, he stopped by to introduce himself and to give me his phone number in case I needed anything. He seemed friendly enough, though there was something in his eyes, a wariness that made me uneasy. He told me to keep my doors locked at night and to always be aware of my surroundings. At the time, I thought he was just being overly cautious, the way older people tend to be. I wish I had listened more carefully. The first few weeks were uneventful. I settled into a routine, chopping wood for the fireplace, clearing snow from the porch, cooking simple meals, and reading by lamplight in the evenings. The cabin had electricity, but the generator was old and unreliable, so I tried to conserve power whenever possible. I had a satellite phone for emergencies and a radio that could pick up a few local stations, though the reception was spotty at best. The isolation was intense, but I found it calming. There were no distractions, no noise, just the quiet hum of the wind and the occasional creak of the cabin settling in the cold. It was on the 16th night that things started to change. I was sitting in the living room, reading a book by the fireplace, when I heard a sound outside. It was faint at first, like someone walking through the snow. I put down my book and listened. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I went to the window and looked out, but all I could see was darkness. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the only light came from the faint glow of the fireplace reflecting off the snow. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it outside, sweeping the beam across the yard. There was nothing there, no tracks, no movement. I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a moose or a wolf passing through, and I went back to my book. But the next night, it happened again, and the night after that. The footsteps would start around 9 in the evening and continue for about an hour, circling the cabin, always staying just out of sight. I started keeping a log, noting the times and the patterns. The footsteps always came from the same direction, starting at the north side of the cabin and moving clockwise. I tried to catch whoever it was in the act. I would turn off all the lights and wait by the window with my flashlight, ready to shine it outside the moment I heard the sound. But every time I looked, there was nothing there. On the 23rd night, I decided to go outside and investigate. I bundled up in my heaviest coat, grabbed my flashlight, and I stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit me immediately, a sharp, biting wind that made my eyes water. I shone my flashlight across the yard, and that is when I saw them. Footprints. They were large, much larger than mine, and they circled the cabin in a perfect loop. I followed them with my flashlight, my heart pounding, and I realized they did not lead away from the cabin. They just circled it, over and over, as if someone had been pacing around the building for hours. And then, at the edge of the light, I saw something else. A pair of eyes, reflecting the beam of my flashlight, staring at me from the tree line. I froze. The eyes did not move, did not blink. They just stared, cold and unfeeling. I do not know how long I stood there, but eventually, I found the courage to back toward the cabin. I kept my flashlight trained on those eyes, and as I moved, they moved too, staying at the same distance, always watching. I stumbled up the steps onto the porch, fumbled with the door, and I slammed it shut behind me. I locked it, then checked every window, every latch, making sure everything was secure. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the living room with my back to the wall, my flashlight in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other, listening for any sound of someone trying to get inside. The next morning, I called Mr. Peterson. I told him about the footsteps and the eyes, and there was a long pause on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was grave. He told me that about 5 years ago, a woman named Sarah Milner had gone missing from a cabin not far from mine. She'd been staying there alone during the winter, and one day she just vanished. Her truck was still parked outside. Her belongings were all inside, but she was gone. The Alaska State Troopers conducted a search, but they never found her. No body, no evidence of foul play, nothing. The case was still open, but it had gone cold. Mr. Peterson said there had been rumors, whispers among the locals that someone had been watching her in the days leading up to her disappearance. People claimed to have seen a figure in the woods, always at a distance, always watching. I felt my blood run cold as he spoke. I asked him if he thought the same person might be watching me, and he did not answer directly. He just told me to be careful, to keep my doors locked, and to call the troopers if I saw anything suspicious. He also offered to come by and check on me, but I told him I would be fine. I did not want to seem paranoid, and part of me still hoped that it was all just a coincidence. But that night, the footsteps returned. This time they were louder, more aggressive. I could hear someone walking right up to the cabin, stopping at the windows, pressing against the glass. I grabbed the satellite phone and I called the Alaska State Troopers. I told them someone was outside my cabin, that I felt threatened, and they said they would send someone out as soon as possible. But it would take at least an hour, maybe longer, given the weather and the distance. I locked myself in the bedroom and I waited. The footsteps continued, moving from window to window, and then I heard the door handle rattle. Someone was trying to get in. I shouted that I had called the police, that they were on their way, but the rattling did not stop. It went on for what felt like an eternity, and then suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the sound. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the satellite phone, my whole body shaking. When the troopers finally arrived, they found fresh footprints in the snow, the same large prints I had seen the night before. They followed the tracks into the woods, but they lost them after about half a mile. The trooper in charge, a woman named Officer Daniels, took my statement and told me they would increase patrols in the area. She also suggested I consider leaving, at least temporarily, until they could determine what was going on. But I refused. This was my family's property, and I was not going to be driven out by some creep. Officer Daniels gave me her direct number and told me to call immediately if anything else happened. She also left me with a canister of bear spray and a whistle, standard precautions for living in the Alaskan wilderness. I thanked her, but I knew that if whoever was out there really wanted to get to me, a whistle and some spray were not going to stop them. The next few nights were quiet, and I started to relax. Maybe the presence of the troopers had scared off whoever had been stalking me. But then, on the 30th night, I woke up to the sound of breaking glass. Someone had smashed one of the windows in the kitchen. I grabbed the bear spray and I ran to the kitchen, shouting that I was armed and that the police were on their way. The window was shattered, and the cold air was pouring in, but there was no one there. I looked outside, and that is when I saw it. A note, pinned to the windowsill with a knife. The paper was wet from the snow, but I could still make out the words, "I know you are alone." I did not wait. I grabbed my keys, my coat, and I ran to my truck. I did not care about the cabin, about the property, about anything except getting away from that place. I drove through the darkness, my hands shaking on the wheel, until I reached Fairbanks. I went straight to the police station, and I told them everything. Officer Daniels met me there, and she arranged for a team to go out to the cabin immediately. They found evidence of a break-in, but no sign of the intruder. The knife that had been used to pin the note to the windowsill was a hunting knife, common in Alaska, impossible to trace. The note itself had no fingerprints. Officer Daniels told me they would continue to investigate, but she was honest with me. Without more evidence, there was not much they could do. She suggested I file for a restraining order, but against whom? We did not even know who was doing this. I never went back to the cabin. My parents hired someone to board up the windows and to secure the property, and eventually they sold it. I moved back in with them for a while, and then I relocated to Anchorage, where I felt safer in a city with more people and more lights. Officer Daniels kept me updated on the investigation, but there were no breaks in the case. The footprints, the note, the break-in, all of it remained a mystery. I'm 27 now, and I still think about those nights at the cabin. I think about Sarah Milner, the woman who disappeared, and I wonder if the same person who was watching me was the one who took her. I wonder if I was next. If I had stayed just one more night, would I have vanished too? The troopers never found answers, and the case is still open. But I know one thing for certain. Someone out there, in the darkness of the Alaskan wilderness, is still watching, and I have no intention of ever giving them another chance to find me. When I was 17 years old, I went on a winter camping trip with my best friend Lily in the backcountry near Denali National Park. This was in early December of 2018, right at the beginning of the polar night season, when daylight was limited to just a few hours a day. We were both experienced campers, having grown up in Alaska, and we thought we knew what we were doing. We had all the right gear, we had filed our trip plan with the park rangers, and we had checked the weather forecast multiple times. Everything pointed to a safe, uneventful trip. We could not have been more wrong. We started our hike early in the morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise. The plan was to hike about 8 miles into the wilderness, set up camp near a frozen lake, and then hike back out 2 days later. The trail was well marked, and we had both hiked it before during the summer months. But winter in Alaska is a different world. The landscape was transformed by snow and ice, and landmarks that had been obvious in the summer were now buried or obscured. We had a map and a compass, and Lily had a GPS device on her phone, so we felt confident we would not get lost. The hike in was harder than we expected. The snow was deep in places, and we had to break trail for most of the way. By the time we reached the lake, the sun was already starting to set, and the temperature was dropping fast. We set up our tent on a flat area about 50 yards from the frozen lake, and we built a fire to warm ourselves and to cook dinner. The sky was clear, and as darkness fell, the stars came out brilliant and sharp against the black sky. It was beautiful, the kind of beauty that makes you feel small and insignificant in the best possible way. We ate dinner and we talked, laughing about stupid things, the way teenagers do. Lily was planning to go to college in Seattle, and she was excited about leaving Alaska, about experiencing life in a big city. I was staying home, planning to work for a year before deciding what to do next. We talked about the future, about our dreams, and as the fire burned down to embers, we crawled into our tent and into our sleeping bags. I remember feeling content, safe, and happy. That feeling did not last long. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of voices. At first, I thought it was Lily talking in her sleep, but when I looked over, she was awake too, staring at the ceiling of the tent with wide eyes. The voices were coming from outside, somewhere near the lake. They were faint, but clear enough that we could tell there were at least 2 people talking. I unzipped the tent, and I looked out. The fire had gone out, and the only light came from the moon, which was bright enough to cast shadows on the snow. I could see figures near the lake, maybe 3 or 4 of them, moving slowly across the ice. Lily whispered that maybe it was other campers, but something about the scene felt wrong. The figures were not dressed for the cold. They were not wearing heavy coats or hats, and they were moving in a strange, jerky way, like puppets on strings. I grabbed my flashlight, and I shone it toward the lake, and the moment the beam of light hit them, they stopped moving. They just stood there, frozen, and then, all at once, they turned to face us. I cannot describe the feeling I had in that moment. It was not fear, exactly. It was something deeper, more primal, like every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get away. Lily grabbed my arm, and she pulled me back into the tent. We zipped it up, and we sat there in the darkness listening. The voices had stopped, and there was no sound of footsteps in the snow, no indication that the figures were approaching, but we could feel them out there, watching us. We did not sleep for the rest of the night. We just sat there, clutching our flashlights, waiting for the sun to rise. When dawn finally came, we packed up our gear as quickly as we could. We did not bother with breakfast, did not bother to clean up the campsite properly. We just wanted to get out of there. As we were loading our backpacks, Lily pointed toward the lake, and she asked me if I saw what she was seeing. I looked, and my blood ran cold. There were footprints in the snow, dozens of them, circling our campsite. But they did not look like normal footprints. They were too large, and the spacing was wrong, as if whoever had made them had been taking impossibly long strides, and they did not lead away from the campsite. They just stopped about 10 feet from our tent, as if the people who had made them had simply vanished into thin air. We started hiking back toward the trailhead, moving as fast as we could. But within an hour, we realized something was wrong. The trail markers we had followed on the way in were gone. Not covered by snow, not knocked down, just gone. We checked the map and the compass, trying to orient ourselves, but nothing made sense. The landmarks we remembered were not where they should have been. The GPS on Lily's phone was not working either. It kept showing our location as somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, which was obviously impossible. We hiked for hours, trying to retrace our steps, but the landscape seemed to shift around us. Trees that I was certain we had passed earlier were now on the wrong side of the trail. A frozen stream that should have been to our left was suddenly to our right. Lily suggested we were just disoriented, that the stress of the previous night was messing with our memory. But I knew better. Something was fundamentally wrong with where we were. By midday, the sun was already starting to set again, and we were no closer to finding the trailhead. We decided to set up camp and wait until morning, hoping that things would make more sense in the light. We found a sheltered spot among some trees and we pitched the tent. We were both exhausted, physically and mentally, and we barely spoke as we prepared for another night in the wilderness. As darkness fell, the voices returned. This time they were closer, just outside our tent, and they were calling our names. Not shouting, not yelling, just speaking in calm conversational tones, as if they were friends trying to get our attention. Lily whispered that we should not respond, that we should not acknowledge them, and I agreed. We lay there in our sleeping bags listening to the voices circle the tent, calling for Caleb and Lily over and over again. And then, one of the voices said something that made my heart stop. It said that we should come out, that we were late, that everyone was waiting for us. The phrasing was strange, the tone was wrong, and I realized with a sickening certainty that whatever was out there was not human. Lily must have realized it too, because she grabbed my hand and she squeezed it so hard I thought she would break my fingers. The voices continued for hours, and then, just before dawn, they stopped. We waited until the sun was fully up before we emerged from the tent, and when we did, we found more footprints. The same impossibly large, impossibly spaced prints we had seen at the lake, but this time there was something else. About 20 feet from our tent, we found a pile of objects: a backpack, a pair of boots, a water bottle, and a jacket. They were old, weathered, as if they had been sitting outside for years. Lily picked up the jacket, and she turned it over, and we both saw the name tag sewn into the lining, S. Milner. I did not recognize the name at the time, but Lily did. She told me that Sarah Milner was a hiker who had gone missing in the area about 3 years earlier. The search teams had never found her body, and the case had eventually been closed as a presumed death due to exposure. But here were her belongings, sitting in the snow miles from where she had last been seen. Lily wanted to take the items with us, to turn them over to the authorities, but I refused. I told her we needed to leave, that we needed to get out of there immediately, and that we could report the location once we were safe. We started hiking again, and this time something was different. The trail markers reappeared, exactly where they should have been. The GPS on Lily's phone started working again, showing our correct location. Within 2 hours, we reached the trailhead, and we practically ran to Lily's truck. We drove straight to the ranger station and we reported everything: the voices, the footprints, the belongings we had found. The rangers took our statement seriously, and they organized a search party to go back to the location where we had found Sarah Milner's things. But when they got there, there was nothing. No backpack, no boots, no jacket. Just undisturbed snow. The rangers suggested we had been disoriented, that the stress and the lack of sleep had caused us to hallucinate or to misremember. But Lily and I know what we saw. We know what we heard. And we know that we were not alone out there in the wilderness. Over the following weeks, we tried to make sense of what had happened. We researched disappearances in the area, and we found that Sarah Milner was not the only person who had gone missing near Denali during the winter months. There were at least 5 other cases over the past decade, all of them hikers or campers who had vanished without a trace. None of them had ever been found. Lily moved to Seattle as planned, and we lost touch after a while. I stayed in Alaska, but I never went back into the backcountry. I still hike, but only on well-traveled trails, and never during the polar night. I'm 24 now, and I still think about that trip, about the voices calling our names, about the footprints that led nowhere. I think about Sarah Milner and the others who disappeared, and I wonder what happened to them. Did they hear the voices too? Did they see the figures on the ice? And if they did, why did they not make it back? I do not have answers, and I doubt I ever will. But I know one thing for certain. There is something out there in the Alaskan wilderness, something that does not want to be found, something that lures people into the darkness and never lets them go. And I consider myself incredibly lucky that Lily and I made it out alive. When I was 21 years old, I worked as a fish and game technician for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. My job required me to spend weeks at a time in remote locations monitoring wildlife populations and collecting data. In January of 2020, I was assigned to a research station on the shores of Lake Iliamna, the largest lake in Alaska, located in the southwestern part of the state. The station was little more than a heated cabin with basic equipment, and during the polar night, it was one of the most isolated places I had ever been. The nearest town was over 40 miles away, and the only access was by bush plane or snowmobile. I was supposed to be there for 3 weeks, but I barely made it through 2. Lake Iliamna has a reputation among the locals. There are stories about the lake, old stories passed down through generations of native Alaskans, about creatures that live beneath the ice, about lights that appear in the darkness, and about people who have vanished without explanation. I had heard these stories before I arrived, but I did not put much stock in them. I was a scientist trained to rely on data and observation, not folklore and superstition. But after what I experienced at that lake, I'm not so sure anymore. The first week was routine. I spent my days checking trap cameras, collecting samples from ice fishing holes, and recording temperatures and weather conditions. The work was tedious but necessary, and I kept myself busy to avoid thinking about the isolation. The sun rose around 11 in the morning and set by 2 in the afternoon, giving me only a few hours of dim twilight to work in. The rest of the time, I was in darkness, with only my flashlight and the lights from the cabin to guide me. It was on the 8th night that I first saw the lights. I had finished my evening meal, and I was sitting at the small desk in the cabin, typing up my notes on the laptop. The generator was humming in the background, and the heater was doing its best to keep the cold at bay. I glanced out the window, just a casual look, and that is when I saw them. There were 3 lights, glowing a pale blue-green color, hovering above the frozen surface of the lake. They were maybe half a mile from the shore, and they were moving slowly, drifting in a circular pattern. My first thought was that they were headlights from snowmobiles, but the color was wrong, and the movement was too smooth, too deliberate. I grabbed my binoculars and I looked closer, but the lights did not resolve into anything recognizable. They were just orbs of light, glowing in the darkness with no apparent source. I watched them for about 10 minutes and then, without warning, they disappeared. Not fading, not moving out of sight, just gone, as if someone had flipped a switch. I told myself it was some kind of natural phenomenon, maybe an optical illusion caused by ice crystals in the air or reflections from the aurora borealis, even though there was no aurora that night. I made a note in my log and I went to bed, but I could not stop thinking about those lights. There was something unnatural about them, something that did not fit with anything I had learned in my training. The next night, the lights appeared again. This time, there were 5 of them, and they were closer to the shore, maybe a quarter mile out. I watched them through the binoculars, and I noticed something I had not seen the night before. The lights were not just hovering. They were pulsing, growing brighter and dimmer in a rhythmic pattern, almost like they were breathing. I grabbed my camera and I tried to take pictures, but every photo came out blurry or overexposed, as if the lights were interfering with the camera's sensor. I decided to go outside and get a closer look. I bundled up in my cold weather gear, grabbed my flashlight, and I walked down to the shore. The temperature was well below 0, and the wind was biting, but I barely noticed. I was focused on the lights. As I approached the edge of the lake, the lights stopped moving. They just hovered there, pulsing, and I had the strangest feeling that they were aware of me, that they were watching me. I stood there for a long time, maybe 20 minutes, just staring at the lights. And then, one of them started moving toward me. It came slowly at first, drifting across the ice, and then it accelerated, closing the distance in seconds. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, and I fell hard onto the snow. The light stopped, about 10 feet in front of me, hovering at eye level, and I could see it clearly now. It was not a solid object. It was more like a ball of energy, shifting and swirling, and inside it, I could see shapes, forms that almost looked like faces, but distorted and wrong. I do not know how long I lay there staring at that light, but eventually, it moved away, drifting back toward the center of the lake. The other lights followed, and within minutes they were gone. I picked myself up and I ran back to the cabin, my heart pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I locked the door, closed all the curtains, and I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, trying to process what I had just seen. Over the next few days, I tried to rationalize the experience. I told myself it was ball lightning, or some kind of electrical discharge caused by the ice, or maybe even a hallucination brought on by the isolation and the lack of sunlight. But deep down, I knew none of those explanations fit. What I had seen was not natural, and it was not random. Those lights had been aware of me, and they had responded to my presence. On the 12th night, I woke up to the sound of tapping on the window. It was rhythmic, persistent, and it was coming from the window above my bed. I turned on my flashlight, and I shone it at the window, but there was nothing there. The tapping continued, moving from window to window, circling the cabin. I got out of bed and I checked each window, but there was nothing outside. No animals, no branches blowing in the wind, nothing that could explain the sound. And then I saw them again. The lights were right outside the cabin, dozens of them surrounding the building. They were brighter than before, and they were pulsing faster, almost frantically. The tapping grew louder, and I realized it was not coming from outside. It was coming from inside the walls, as if something was moving through the structure of the cabin itself. I grabbed the satellite phone, and I called my supervisor, telling him I needed an immediate extraction. He asked me what was wrong, and I did not know what to say. How do you explain something like this without sounding insane? I told him there was a medical emergency, that I was experiencing severe psychological distress, and he agreed to send a plane in the morning, but I had to make it through the night. I sat in the center of the cabin, surrounded by every light I could find, and I waited. The tapping continued, and the lights outside grew brighter, and I could hear voices now, faint and echoing, speaking in a language I did not recognize. They were not threatening, exactly, but they were insistent, as if they were trying to tell me something, or maybe calling me to come outside. I did not go outside. I stayed in the cabin, clutching the satellite phone, counting the minutes until dawn. When the sun finally rose, the lights disappeared and the tapping stopped. I packed my gear as quickly as I could, and when the bush plane arrived a few hours later, I did not even say goodbye to the cabin. I just got on the plane and I left. My supervisor asked me what had happened, and I told him the truth. I told him about the lights, about the tapping, about the voices. He listened, and when I was finished, he told me that I was not the first person to report strange phenomena at Lake Iliamna. There had been other technicians, other researchers, who had seen similar things. Most of them had dismissed it as stress or isolation, but a few had reported the same glowing lights, the same sense of being watched. The department did not have an official explanation, and they did not investigate further. They just reassigned people and moved on. I was given a different assignment, a position closer to Anchorage, and I never went back to Lake Iliamna. But I did some research on my own. I talked to some of the local native Alaskan elders, and they told me stories about the lake, about the spirits that live beneath the ice, and about the lights that appear during the darkest months. They said the lights are the souls of people who drowned in the lake, trapped between this world and the next, searching for a way home. They said that if you see the lights, you should not approach them, because they will try to pull you in, to add you to their number. I do not know if I believe in spirits or souls, but I believe what I saw. Those lights were not natural, and they were not random. They were intelligent, purposeful, and they were trying to communicate, or maybe to lure me out onto the ice. I think about what might have happened if I had gone outside that last night, if I had followed the lights onto the lake. Would I have disappeared, like so many others before me? Would my name have been added to the list of unsolved disappearances in the Alaskan wilderness? I am 26 now, and I still work for the Department of Fish and Game, but I refuse any assignments that involve remote locations during the polar night. I have told my story to a few people, and most of them look at me like I am crazy, like I imagine the whole thing. But I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. There is something out there, beneath the ice of Lake Iliamna, something old and strange and unknowable, and I have no intention of ever going back to find out what it is. When I was 24 years old, I was driving home from Anchorage to my apartment in Wasilla after visiting my sister. It was late January of 2022, right in the heart of the polar night season, and I had stayed longer than I intended, which meant I was driving home in complete darkness. The Glen Highway between Anchorage and Wasilla is a well-traveled road, but during the winter, especially late at night, it can feel incredibly isolated. There are stretches where you will not see another car for miles, where the only light comes from your headlights and the occasional street lamp. I had driven this route hundreds of times, and I had never felt unsafe. But that night changed everything. I left my sister's house around 10 in the evening. The weather forecast had called for clear skies, and the roads were in good condition, so I was not worried about the drive. I had a full tank of gas, my phone was charged, and I had an emergency kit in the trunk just in case. I was listening to a podcast, something about true crime, ironically enough, and I was feeling relaxed, maybe even a little drowsy. About halfway home, near the town of Eagle River, I noticed a car behind me. It was driving close, too close, and its headlights were bright enough that they were reflecting off my rearview mirror and making it hard to see. I adjusted the mirror and I sped up a little, hoping the car would pass me or back off, but it stayed right on my bumper. I tried slowing down, thinking maybe the driver was in a hurry and would go around me, but they slowed down too, maintaining the same distance. A knot of anxiety started to form in my stomach. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was probably just someone who did not realize how close they were following, but something felt wrong. The way the car was matching my speed, the way it stayed perfectly centered behind me, it felt deliberate. I decided to pull over at the next gas station and let the car pass. There was a small station about 5 miles ahead, and I figured I could stop there, grab a coffee, and give the driver plenty of space to move on. But as I approached the gas station, the car behind me turned off its headlights. Not dimmed, not switched to low beams, completely off. I could still see the outline of the vehicle in my rearview mirror, a dark shape against the darker road, but without the headlights. I could not tell what kind of car it was or how close it was getting. I pulled into the gas station, my hands shaking on the wheel, and I parked under one of the bright lights near the entrance. I looked in my mirror, expecting to see the car pull in behind me or drive past on the highway, but it was gone. I sat there for a moment, my heart pounding, and I scanned the parking lot and the road. There was no sign of the vehicle. It was as if it had vanished the moment I pulled off the highway. I went inside the gas station, more to calm my nerves than anything else. The clerk was a young guy, maybe 20, and he was scrolling through his phone, barely looking up when I walked in. I bought a coffee, and I asked him if he had seen a car pull in behind me, describing the dark shape and the lack of headlights. He shook his head and said he had not seen anything. I thanked him, and I went back to my car, feeling foolish for letting my imagination get the better of me. I got back on the highway, and I continued driving toward Wasilla. The podcast was still playing, but I was not really listening anymore. I kept checking my rearview mirror, looking for any sign of the car, but the road behind me was empty. I was about 10 miles from home when I saw it again. The same dark shape, no headlights, sitting on my bumper. My breath caught in my throat, and I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I sped up, pushing my car to 70, then 80 miles per hour, but the vehicle behind me matched my speed effortlessly. I tried to get a better look at it, but without headlights, it was almost invisible in the darkness. All I could see was the vague outline of a truck or an SUV, larger than my sedan, and close enough that if I braked suddenly, it would rear end me. I grabbed my phone and I called 911. The dispatcher answered, and I told her someone was following me, that I felt threatened, and that I needed help. She asked me where I was, and I gave her my location as best I could, estimating I was about 8 miles from the Wasilla exit. She told me to stay on the line, that she was sending a trooper to intercept me, and that I should keep driving and not stop for any reason. I did as she said, keeping my eyes on the road and on the rearview mirror. The vehicle behind me stayed close, and I could feel the tension building in my chest, the panic threatening to overwhelm me. And then, without warning, the vehicle started flashing its lights. Not the headlights, but interior lights flickering on and off in a rapid, chaotic pattern. It was disorienting, and for a moment, I thought I saw someone in the driver's seat, a figure silhouetted against the flashing lights, but I could not make out any details. The dispatcher was still on the line, and I told her what was happening. She said the trooper was close, that I should keep driving, and that I should not engage with the other driver. But then the vehicle behind me started to ram my car. It was not a hard hit, just a bump, but it was enough to jolt me forward in my seat and send a spike of adrenaline through my body. The dispatcher heard the impact, and she told me to stay calm, to keep driving, and that help was almost there. The vehicle rammed me again, harder this time, and I felt my car swerve slightly. I corrected the steering, my heart racing, and I pushed the accelerator as far as it would go. My car was not built for high-speed chases, and I could hear the engine straining, but I did not care. I just needed to get away from whoever was behind me. And then I saw the flashing lights of a trooper's car up ahead, parked on the side of the highway with its lights on. Relief flooded through me, and I started to slow down, preparing to pull over. But the vehicle behind me did not slow down. It accelerated, pulling up alongside me, and for the first time, I got a clear look at it. It was a dark-colored SUV with tinted windows and no license plate. The driver's side window was down, and I could see a figure inside, wearing a dark hoodie and a mask, something that looked like a ski mask or a balaclava. The figure turned to look at me, and even though I could not see their face, I could feel their eyes on me, cold and calculating. The SUV swerved toward me, trying to force me off the road, and I jerked the wheel to the right, barely avoiding the collision. The trooper must have seen what was happening because I heard the siren, loud and piercing, and the trooper's car pulled onto the highway, accelerating toward us. The SUV hesitated for a moment, and then it sped past me, disappearing into the darkness ahead. The trooper followed, and I slowed down, pulling over onto the shoulder, my whole body shaking. Another trooper arrived a few minutes later, and I gave him my statement. I described the SUV, the masked driver, the ramming, everything. He took notes, and he told me that the first trooper had chased the SUV for several miles but had lost it near the park's highway junction. There were no cameras in the area, and without a license plate, there was not much they could do immediately. He asked me if I had any idea who might want to harm me, if I had any enemies or anyone who might have a grudge against me. I told him I did not, that I was just driving home from my sister's house, and that I had never seen the SUV or the driver before. The trooper escorted me the rest of the way home, and when I got to my apartment, I locked every door and window, and I sat on the couch, trying to process what had just happened. The Alaska State Troopers launched an investigation, and over the next few weeks, I was interviewed multiple times. They checked traffic cameras, gas station footage, and they even put out a public appeal for information about the SUV. But they never found it. The vehicle, the driver, everything just vanished. About a month later, a trooper called me and told me they had made a connection. There had been 3 other incidents on the Glen Highway over the past year, all involving a dark SUV with no license plates, all targeting women driving alone at night. In one case, the woman had been forced off the road and her car had rolled into a ditch. She survived, but she was badly injured, and she could not provide a description of the driver. In another case, the woman had managed to escape, just like I had, by flagging down a passing truck driver. The third case was still under investigation, and the victim had not been as lucky. Her car had been found abandoned on the side of the highway with signs of a struggle, but she was never found. The trooper told me they believed the same person was responsible for all the incidents, and that I was lucky to have escaped. They were working with the FBI, treating it as a potential serial abduction case, but without more evidence, they were at a standstill. He advised me to vary my routes, to avoid driving alone at night, and to always keep my phone charged and within reach. I thanked him, but his words offered little comfort. I moved out of Wasilla a few months later. I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whoever had been in that SUV was still out there, still looking for me. I relocated to Fairbanks, where I had family, and I took a job that did not require me to drive long distances at night. I sold my car, and I started taking the bus or getting rides from friends. I know it sounds extreme, but after what I went through, I could not take any chances. I am 27 now, and I still think about that night on the Glen Highway. I think about the masked driver, the ramming, the chase, and I wonder how close I came to becoming another statistic, Another unsolved disappearance. The troopers never caught the person responsible, and as far as I know, the case is still open. But I also know that I'm not the only victim, and that whoever is out there is still hunting, still waiting for the next woman driving alone in the darkness. I tell this story not to scare people, but to warn them. If you are driving alone in Alaska during the polar night, be vigilant. Pay attention to the cars around you. Trust your instincts. And if something feels wrong, do not hesitate to call for help. Because the darkness hides more than just the landscape. It hides predators, people who know that the isolation and the cold make perfect cover for their crimes. And I consider myself incredibly fortunate that I lived to tell this story. When I was 25 years old, I worked as a security guard for a remote communications relay station about 60 miles north of Nome, Alaska. The station was essential for maintaining cellular and radio communications across the region, and my job was to monitor the equipment, perform basic maintenance, and ensure no one tampered with the facility. It was December of 2023, right in the heart of the polar night, when the sun did not rise for weeks at a time. The station was completely automated, so I was the only person there. The nearest town was over 30 miles away, and the only access was by snowmobile or small plane. I was scheduled to stay for a month, rotating shifts with another guard who would take over in January. I barely made it 3 weeks before I requested an emergency evacuation. The station itself was a small compound consisting of 3 buildings. The main operations center, where all the equipment was housed, a generator building, and a small living quarters where I stayed. The buildings were connected by enclosed walkways, which was a blessing during the brutal winter weather. Everything was heated and insulated, and I had enough supplies to last far longer than a month. On paper, it was a cushy job. In reality, it became the most terrifying experience of my life. The first week was quiet. I settled into a routine, checking equipment every 4 hours, clearing snow from the walkways, cooking simple meals, and killing time between shifts by reading or watching movies on my laptop. The isolation was intense, but I had expected that. What I had not expected was the noise. It started on the 8th night. I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard footsteps above me. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, pacing back and forth across the ceiling. My quarters were a single-story building, and there was no attic, no crawl space, nothing above me except the roof. I grabbed my flashlight and I went outside, shining the beam up at the roof. There was nothing there. No tracks in the snow, no animals, no explanation. I went back inside, and the footsteps continued for another 10 minutes before they stopped. I convinced myself it was the building settling in the cold, that the metal roof was contracting and making noise. But deep down, I knew it did not sound like settling. It sounded like someone walking. The next night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, and they lasted longer. I tried to ignore them, to focus on a book I was reading, but the sound was impossible to tune out. It was rhythmic, purposeful, and it moved from one end of the building to the other, always staying directly above me. I went outside again, and again there was nothing. I even climbed onto the roof using a ladder from the generator building, but the surface was smooth and undisturbed. There were no tracks, no marks, no signs that anything had been up there. On the 11th night, I decided to stay awake and wait for their footsteps. I made a pot of coffee, and I sat at the small table in my quarters, my flashlight ready, my eyes on the ceiling. Around midnight, the footsteps started. I grabbed my flashlight and I ran outside, determined to catch whatever was making the noise. But when I got outside and looked up, the footsteps stopped. I stood there in the cold, scanning the roof with my flashlight, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the snow. Large, deep footprints, starting at the edge of the roof and walking toward the center, where they stopped. They did not lead off the roof. They just ended, as if whoever had made them had simply vanished. I climbed onto the roof again, and I examined the prints more closely. They were boot prints, definitely human, but the size was wrong. They were enormous, at least a size 16 or 17, and the depth suggested someone incredibly heavy. I took pictures with my phone, and then I went back inside. I did not sleep that night. I just sat there staring at the ceiling, waiting for the footsteps to return. They did not. But something else happened that was even worse. Around 3 in the morning, I heard a sound coming from beneath the floor. It was a scraping sound, like metal on concrete, slow and deliberate. I stood up and I listened, and I realized the sound was moving. It was coming from directly beneath me, and it was following me as I walked. I moved to the left, and the sound moved to the left. I moved to the right, and the sound moved to the right. Whatever was making the noise was tracking my movements from below. I knew there was no basement in the building. I had seen the blueprints during my orientation, and the structure was built directly on a concrete foundation. There was no space beneath the floor, no crawl space, no tunnels. But the sound was undeniable, and it was getting louder. I grabbed a flashlight and I went outside, circling the building, looking for any sign of an entrance or opening. That is when I found it. A hatch, partially hidden by snow, on the north side of the building. It was maybe 3 feet by 3 feet, made of rusted metal, and it had a padlock that looked like it had not been opened in years. I cleared the snow away from the hatch, and I examined the lock. It was old, but it was intact, and there was no sign that it had been tampered with. But the scraping sound was still coming from beneath me, and I knew that whatever was down there had to be connected to this hatch. I went back to the operations center, and I called my supervisor using the satellite phone. I told him about the footsteps, the hatch, and the sound beneath the floor. There was a long pause, and then he told me something I did not expect. He said that the station had been built on the site of an old military installation from World War II, and that there were rumors of underground tunnels and bunkers that had been sealed off decades ago. He said the company had never bothered to investigate because the old structures were not supposed to be accessible, but they were accessible. Someone, or something, was down there, and they knew I was there. I spent the next few days trying to ignore the sounds, trying to convince myself that it was just the wind or the building settling, but the noises continued. The footsteps on the roof, the scraping beneath the floor, and now, voices. I would hear them late at night, faint and muffled, speaking in a language I did not recognize. They seemed to be coming from the walls, from the floor, from everywhere and nowhere at once. On the 18th night, I decided I had to open the hatch. I needed to know what was down there to confirm that I was not losing my mind. I grabbed a crowbar from the generator building, and I went back to the hatch. I pried off the old padlock, and I lifted the hatch open. A blast of cold, stale air hit me, and I shone my flashlight down into the darkness. There was a ladder, leading down into what looked like a narrow tunnel. The walls were concrete, covered in frost and decay, and I could see old wiring and pipes running along the ceiling. I should have closed the hatch and walked away. I should have called my supervisor and told him to send someone else to investigate. But I did not. I climbed down the ladder, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, and I found myself in a long corridor. The walls were lined with old storage crates, rusted and forgotten, and there were doors on either side, most of them sealed or collapsed. I walked slowly, my breath fogging in front of me, and I listened. The voices were louder down here, echoing through the tunnel, and I realized they were coming from deeper in, from somewhere I could not see. I followed the voices, moving deeper into the tunnel, and I came to a large room. It was some kind of command center, with old desks and equipment covered in dust and cobwebs, and in the center of the room, there was a table. On the table were personal belongings, a watch, a wallet, a set of dog tags, and a journal. I picked up the journal, and I flipped through the pages. It was written by a soldier stationed at the installation in 1943, and the entries detailed his experience during the polar night. He wrote about the isolation, the darkness, and the strange things that happened in the tunnels. He wrote about voices in the walls, about footsteps where no one should be walking, and about a presence that watched them from the shadows. The final entry was dated January 15th, 1944, and it simply said, "It knows we are here. We cannot leave." I dropped the journal, and I ran. I ran back through the tunnel, back to the ladder, and I climbed up as fast as I could. I slammed the hatch shut, and I dragged a heavy crate over it, sealing it. I went back to my quarters, and I called my supervisor. I told him I was done, that I needed to leave immediately, and that I was not going back into that tunnel. He tried to calm me down, but I was not listening. I packed my belongings, and I waited by the operations center for the plane to arrive. The extraction took 2 days to arrange, and during those 2 days, the sounds continued. The footsteps, the scraping, the voices. They were constant, relentless, and I knew that whatever was down in those tunnels was aware of me, and it was not happy that I had disturbed it. When the plane finally arrived, I did not even say goodbye to the station. I just got on the plane, and I left. I'm 30 now, and I have not been back to Nome since. The company sent another guard to take over my shift, and according to the reports, he did not experience anything unusual. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. There's something in those tunnels, something that has been there since the 1940s, and it is still waiting in the darkness. I do not know what it is, and I do not want to know. I just know that I will never go back. When I was 18 years old, I spent a winter working at a small indigenous cultural center in the village of Kivalina, on the northwestern coast of Alaska. Kivalina is one of the most remote villages in the state, accessible only by plane or boat, and during the polar night season, it is one of the darkest and most isolated places you can imagine. The village sits on a narrow barrier reef island, with the Chukchi Sea on one side and the Kivalina River on the other. It is home to about 400 Inupiat people, and in recent years, it has been threatened by erosion and rising sea levels. But when I was there in December of 2017, those concerns felt distant. What I experienced during those weeks has stayed with me ever since, and it has fundamentally changed the way I think about the world. I had taken the job as part of a cultural exchange program through my university. I was studying anthropology, and I wanted to learn more about Alaska Native cultures and traditions. The cultural center was small, just a single building where local elders would come to teach traditional skills like ivory carving, skin sewing, and storytelling. My job was to help with administrative tasks, to assist with organizing events, and to document the stories the elders shared. It was an incredible opportunity, and I was excited to be there, even though I knew the winter would be harsh. The darkness of the polar night was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The sun did not rise for over 2 months, and the only light came from the moon, the stars, and the occasional flicker of the aurora borealis. The cold was brutal, often dropping to 30 or 40 below zero, and the wind from the sea was relentless. But the people of Kivalina were warm and welcoming, and I quickly felt at home in the village. It was during my second week there that I first heard about the spirits. I was sitting in the cultural center with an elder named Agnes, who was teaching me how to prepare caribou hide for sewing. We were alone in the building, and she was telling me stories about the old days, about how her grandparents had lived on the land, following the caribou herds and hunting seals. And then, almost casually, she mentioned the spirits that lived in the tundra and beneath the ice. She said that during the polar night, when the world was dark and the barrier between the living and the dead was thinnest, the spirits would come closer to the village. She said that some of them were the souls of ancestors watching over the living, but others were different, older, and not always friendly. I asked her if she believed in these spirits, and she looked at me with an expression that was both serious and slightly amused. She said that belief was not the right word. The spirits were not something you believed in or did not believe in. They were simply part of the world, as real as the ice and the wind. She told me that if I ever saw or heard something I could not explain, I should not be afraid, but I should also not be careless. I should respect the spirits, acknowledge their presence, and stay close to the village and the people. At the time, I thought it was just folklore, the kind of stories that every culture has, but a few nights later, I had my first encounter. I was walking back to the house where I was staying, which was about a quarter mile from the cultural center. It was around 8 in the evening, and the village was quiet. Most people were inside, sheltering from the cold, and the only sounds were the wind and the distant barking of sled dogs. I was walking along the narrow road, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, when I heard singing. It was faint at first, just a thread of sound carried on the wind, but as I stopped and listened, it grew clearer. It was a woman's voice, singing in Inupiaq, the local language. The melody was beautiful, haunting, and deeply sad, and it seemed to be coming from somewhere out on the tundra, beyond the edge of the village. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, but all I could see was darkness and snow. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but the singing continued, uninterrupted. I should have gone back to the village, should have found someone to come with me, but I was curious. I walked toward the sound, leaving the road and stepping out onto the tundra. The snow was deep, and I had to move slowly, but the singing was drawing me forward, pulling me like a thread. I walked for maybe 5 minutes, and then the singing stopped. I stood there in the silence, my flashlight sweeping across the empty landscape, and I realized I had made a mistake. I was alone, in the dark, far from the village, and I had no idea where the singing had come from or where it had gone. I turned to go back, and that is when I saw her. She was standing about 20 feet away, barely visible in the dim light of my flashlight. She was an older woman, dressed in traditional fur clothing, and she was staring at me with dark, unblinking eyes. I froze, my heart pounding, and I called out to her, asking if she was all right, if she needed help. She did not respond. She just stood there, watching me, and then she smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was cold, empty, and it made my skin crawl. I took a step backward, and she took a step forward. I took another step, and she matched it, always maintaining the same distance. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, and I turned and I ran. I ran as fast as I could through the snow, stumbling and falling, but I did not stop. I could hear her behind me, not running, just walking, but somehow keeping pace. I did not look back. I just ran until I reached the road, and then I kept running until I reached the house where I was staying. I burst through the door and I slammed it shut behind me, gasping for breath. The family I was staying with, a couple named Tom and Sarah, asked me what was wrong. I told them about the singing, about the woman, on the tundra, and Tom's expression grew serious. He asked me to describe her, and when I did, he exchanged a look with Sarah. He told me that what I had seen was not a living person. He said it was a spirit, one that sometimes appeared during the polar night, luring people away from the village. He said I was lucky I had run, because if I had followed her too far, I might not have found my way back. I did not sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind, and thinking about the woman on the tundra. The next day, I went to see Agnes, and I told her what had happened. She nodded, as if she had expected it, and she told me that the spirit I had seen was known among the Inupiat. She was called the Kayak Spirit, and she was said to be the ghost of a woman who had died alone on the tundra during a harsh winter, separated from her family. She wandered the darkness during the polar night, searching for companionship, but anyone who followed her would become lost and would freeze to death. Agnes gave me a small amulet, carved from bone, and she told me to wear it around my neck. She said it would protect me, that it would keep the spirits at bay. I thanked her, and I wore the amulet every day for the rest of my time in Kivalina. But the encounters did not stop. Over the next few weeks, I heard the singing several more times, always at night, always coming from the tundra. I never went toward it again, but I could hear it, faint and mournful, and it filled me with a deep sense of sadness. I also saw other things, shadows moving at the edge of the village, figures standing on the ice, always watching, always waiting. The people in the village told me that this was normal during the polar night, that the spirits were always present, and that as long as I respected them and stayed within the boundaries of the village, I would be safe. But one night, about a week before I was scheduled to leave, something happened that I still cannot explain. I was alone in the cultural center, working late on a project, when the lights went out. The generator had been running fine all evening, so I assumed it was just a temporary issue. I grabbed my flashlight and I went to check the breaker box, but before I could reach it, I heard footsteps. They were coming from the back room, the storage area where we kept supplies and tools. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but there was no response. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, moving toward me. I shone my flashlight toward the back room, and I saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was the woman from the tundra, the kayak spirit. She was inside the building, standing just a few feet away from me, and she was staring at me with those same dark, unblinking eyes. I wanted to run, but I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. She took a step toward me, and I could feel the temperature drop, my breath fogging in the cold air. And then she spoke. Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper, and she was speaking in Inupiaq. I did not understand the words, but I could feel the emotion behind them: loneliness, grief, and an overwhelming sense of loss. I do not know how long I stood there, staring at her, but eventually she turned, and she walked back into the darkness of the storage room. The lights flickered back on, and when I looked into the back room, there was no one there. I left the cultural center immediately, and I went straight to Tom and Sarah's house. I told them what had happened, and Tom said that the spirit had been trying to communicate with me, that she had recognized something in me, perhaps a kindness or an openness to the unseen world. He said that by wearing the amulet Agnes had given me, I had protected myself, but that the spirit was still reaching out, still searching for connection. I left Kivalina a week later, and I have not been back since. But the experience changed me. I no longer dismiss stories about spirits and the supernatural as simple folklore. I know now that there are things in this world that we cannot fully understand, forces and presences that exist beyond our everyday perception. The people of Kivalina live with these spirits, acknowledging them, respecting them, and maintaining a balance between the living and the dead. And I carry that lesson with me, along with the bone amulet Agnes gave me, which I still wear to this day. I'm 26 now, and I still think about the kayak spirit, about her loneliness and her endless search. I think about the polar night, about the darkness that descends on Alaska, and about the thin barrier between our world and whatever lies beyond. And I know that if I ever return to Kivalina, I will be more careful, more respectful, and more aware of the spirits that walk in the darkness. When I was 23 years old, I worked as a night security guard at a remote fuel depot about 40 miles southeast of Bethel, Alaska. The depot was used to store heating oil and gasoline for the surrounding villages, and during the winter months, it was essential infrastructure for the region. My job was to monitor the facility, ensure that no one tampered with the tanks or equipment, and to perform regular safety checks throughout the night. It was January of 2021, right in the middle of the polar night, and the isolation was extreme. The nearest village was 10 miles away, and I was the only person at the facility. My shift ran from 6 in the evening to 6 in the morning, and for most of that time, I was alone in the darkness with only a radio and a satellite phone for communication. What happened during my third week on the job still haunts me, and it has left me questioning how safe any of us really are in the remote corners of Alaska. The depot consisted of 6 large fuel tanks, a small operations building where I spent most of my time, a maintenance shed, and a perimeter fence with motion sensor lights. The security system was basic but functional, and I had been told during my training that the biggest threats were wildlife, particularly bears and moose, and the occasional vandalism attempt. No one had ever mentioned anything more serious, and I had no reason to believe I would encounter anything dangerous. The first 2 weeks passed without incident. I would arrive at 6 in the evening, check in with the day shift guard, and then settle into the operations building to monitor the cameras and perform my rounds. Every 2 hours, I would walk the perimeter, checking the fence line, the tanks, and the equipment. It was cold, brutal work, with temperatures often dropping below 30 degrees below zero, but I had all the right gear and I kept myself busy. The darkness was oppressive, but I'd gotten used to it, and the motion sensor lights provided enough illumination to make me feel safe. It was on the 15th night that things started to feel wrong. I was sitting in the operations building, watching the security monitors, when I noticed movement on one of the cameras. It was positioned to cover the northeast corner of the facility, near the maintenance shed. I leaned closer to the screen, trying to make out what I was seeing, and I realized there was someone standing just outside the fence. They were not moving, just standing there, facing the camera. I grabbed my flashlight and I went outside, my breath fogging in the cold air, and I walked toward the northeast corner. When I got there, the fence was empty. There was no one there, no tracks in the snow, nothing to indicate anyone had been there at all. I went back inside and I reviewed the footage. The figure had been there, clear as day, standing just beyond the fence, but when I had gone outside, they had vanished. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by the motion sensor lights, but the unease lingered. I called the day shift guard on the radio and I mentioned what I had seen and he laughed it off. He said the cameras picked up weird things sometimes, that the cold could affect the sensors, and that I should not worry about it. But I could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next night, the figure appeared again. This time, it was on a different camera near the south fence line. I watched it on the monitor, and I saw it move. It was slow, deliberate, walking along the fence as if inspecting it. I grabbed my coat and my flashlight, and I went outside. I approached the south fence line, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, and I called out, asking if anyone was there. There was no response. I walked the entire length of the fence, but there was no one, and yet, when I went back inside and reviewed the footage, the figure was there, moving along the fence, always staying just out of reach of my flashlight. This continued for 3 more nights. The figure would appear on the cameras, always in different locations, always moving, and I would go outside to investigate, but I would find nothing. On the 18th night, I decided to stay outside, to wait and watch, to see if I could catch whoever it was in the act. I bundled up, and I positioned myself near the operations building with a clear view of the perimeter. I turned off my flashlight, and I waited. Around midnight, I saw movement near the west fence line. It was the figure, walking slowly along the fence, and this time, I could see it clearly. It was a man, tall and dressed in dark clothing, and he was carrying something in his hand. I could not make out what it was, but the way he was moving, the deliberate way he was inspecting the fence, made it clear he was not just passing through. He was scouting the facility, looking for weaknesses. I turned on my flashlight, and I shone it directly at him, and I shouted for him to stop. For a moment, he froze, and I could see his face in the beam of light. He was wearing a ski mask, and his eyes were dark and cold. And then, he ran. He did not run away from the facility. He ran toward it, toward me. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding, and I ran back to the operations building. I locked the door behind me, and I grabbed the satellite phone. I called the Alaska State Troopers, and I told them someone was trying to break into the facility, that I felt threatened, and that I needed help immediately. The dispatcher told me a trooper would be dispatched, but it would take at least an hour to reach me. Maybe longer, given the weather and the distance. She told me to stay inside, to lock all the doors, and to not engage with the intruder. I did as she said, and I watched the monitors trying to track where the man had gone. But the cameras showed nothing. He had disappeared again, as if he had never been there. I sat there, my back against the wall, clutching a wrench I had grabbed from the toolkit, and I waited. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an hour, and then I heard it. the sound of metal scraping against metal. Someone was trying to open the door to the operations building. I shouted that the police were on their way, that I was armed, but the scraping continued. I could see the door handle moving, and I realized with a sickening certainty that whoever was out there was not going to stop. And then the lights went out. All of them. The perimeter lights, the motion sensors, everything. The only light came from the dim glow of the security monitors, and I could barely see. I heard footsteps outside, multiple sets of footsteps, and I realized there was more than one person. They were surrounding the building, coordinating their movements, and I knew that if they got inside, I was in serious danger. I grabbed the satellite phone and I called the dispatcher back. I told her they were trying to break in, that the lights were out, and that I did not know how much longer I could hold them off. She told me to stay calm, that the trooper was close, and that I should barricade the door if I could. I grabbed everything I could find, chairs, file cabinets, a desk, and I piled them against the door, and then I heard the sound of breaking glass. One of the windows had been smashed, and I could see a hand reaching through, trying to unlock the window from the inside. I did not think. I just grabbed the wrench, and I hit the hand as hard as I could. There was a scream, and the hand pulled back. I heard shouting outside, angry voices, and then the sound of an engine starting. I looked out the window, and I saw headlights, a truck or an SUV, and I watched as it sped away from the facility, disappearing into the darkness. The trooper arrived about 10 minutes later, and I met him outside, shaking and covered in sweat despite the cold. I told him everything, and he inspected the facility. The window was broken, and there were footprints in the snow, multiple sets leading to and from the fence line. The trooper took photographs and collected evidence, and he told me that this was not the first time there had been an attempted break-in at a fuel depot in the region. There had been 3 other incidents over the past year, all targeting remote facilities, all during the polar night when visibility was low and response times were slow. He said the Alaska State Troopers believed it was an organized group, possibly attempting to steal fuel or equipment, and that they were using the darkness and the isolation to their advantage. He advised the company to increase security, to install better lighting and alarm systems, and to consider having 2 guards on site instead of 1. But for me, the damage was done. I quit the next day. The investigation continued for several weeks, and the troopers eventually identified the truck that had been at the facility. It had been stolen from a village about 50 miles away, and it was found abandoned a few days later, burned out and stripped of any identifying features. The people who had tried to break in were never caught. The footprints did not match anyone in the local databases, and there were no witnesses, no leads, nothing to go on. I moved back to Anchorage, and I took a job in retail, something safe and boring where I did not have to be alone in the dark. But the experience has stayed with me. I think about how close I came to being hurt, or worse, and I think about the fact that whoever was out there is still free, still operating, still targeting remote facilities where guards like me are alone and vulnerable. I am 28 now, and I still struggle with the fear that comes from that night. I do not like being alone, especially at night, and I always make sure my doors and windows are locked. I tell this story not just to share what happened to me, but to warn others who work in remote locations in Alaska. The polar night is not just dark, it is dangerous. It provides cover for people with bad intentions, people who know that help is far away and that the odds are in their favor. And I consider myself incredibly lucky that I survived to tell this story. When I was 16 years old, I went on a family trip to visit relatives in the small village of Anaktuvuk Pass, located in the Brooks Range of northern Alaska. Anaktuvuk Pass is one of the most remote communities in the United States, accessible only by plane, and it sits at the continental divide between the Arctic and the Pacific watersheds. My mother had grown up there before moving to Fairbanks, and she wanted my younger brother and me to experience the village and to connect with our extended family. We arrived in mid-December, of 2019, right at the peak of the polar night, when the sun would not rise for over a month. I was excited about the trip, curious about the place where my mother had spent her childhood, and eager to meet cousins and relatives I had only heard about. What happened during our stay has never been fully explained, and it remains one of the most disturbing and confusing experiences of my life. We stayed with my aunt and uncle in their small house on the edge of the village. My younger brother, who was 12 at the time, and I shared a room while my parents slept in the guest room. The house was warm and comfortable, heated by a wood stove and a small oil heater, and my aunt had prepared a feast for our arrival. The village itself was beautiful in a stark, austere way, with about 200 residents, most of them Inupiat, living in houses scattered across the valley. The surrounding mountains were covered in snow, and the darkness was absolute, broken only by the lights from the houses and the occasional glow of the aurora borealis. On our third night in the village, something strange happened. I woke up around 3 in the morning feeling disoriented and confused. I looked over at my brother's bed, and he was gone. I sat up, my heart racing, and I called out for him, but there was no response. I got out of bed and I walked through the house, checking the bathroom, the kitchen, the living room, but he was not there. My parents were not in their room either, and neither were my aunt and uncle. The house was empty. I went to the front door and I looked outside. The village was dark and silent, and there were no lights on in any of the houses. I called out again, my voice breaking the stillness, but there was no answer. I grabbed my coat and my boots and I stepped outside. The cold hit me immediately, a sharp biting wind that made my eyes water. I walked toward the center of the village, calling for my family, looking in windows, knocking on doors, but there was no one. The entire village was empty. Every house, every building completely deserted. I do not know how long I walked, but eventually I found myself at the edge of the village, standing at the base of one of the mountains. I looked up, and that is when I saw them. There were lights in the sky, not the aurora, but something different. They were bright, pulsing orbs of white and blue light, moving in patterns that did not make sense, spiraling and diving and rising again. I stood there, mesmerized, and I felt a strange pull, as if the lights were calling to me, urging me to come closer. And then I heard a voice. It was my mother's voice, faint and distant, calling my name. I turned around, and I saw her standing at the edge of the village, waving at me. I ran toward her, relief flooding through me, and when I reached her, I grabbed her arm and I asked her where she had been, where everyone had been. She looked at me with a confused expression, and she said she had been looking for me, that I had wandered out of the house in the middle of the night, and that she had been searching for me for hours. I told her that was not true, that I had woken up and everyone was gone, that the entire village was empty. She shook her head, and she said that was not possible, that everyone was still asleep, that I must have been dreaming or sleepwalking. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had experienced. She took me back to the house, and when we got there, my brother was in his bed, asleep. My father and my aunt and uncle were also asleep, exactly where they should have been. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the past hour or two had never occurred. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. I just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had happened. The next morning, I told my family about the experience, and they all looked at me with a mixture of concern and disbelief. My mother suggested I had been sleepwalking, that the darkness and the isolation had disoriented me. My brother said he had not woken up at all, that he had slept straight through the night. My aunt and uncle were more thoughtful. They exchanged a look, and my uncle said that strange things sometimes happened during the polar night, that the darkness could play tricks on the mind, and that I should not worry about it. But then my aunt said something that made my blood run cold. She said that about 10 years earlier, something similar had happened to a family in the village. They had all woken up one morning with no memory of the previous night, and they had found that several hours were missing from their lives. They could not account for the time, could not remember what they had done or where they had been. The village elders had said it was the work of spirits, that the darkness had opened a doorway between worlds, and that the family had been taken somewhere they were not supposed to go. My aunt said the family had left the village shortly after, too frightened to stay. I asked her if she believed the story, and she said she did not know. She said that in Alaska, especially in the remote villages, there were things that could not be explained by science or logic, things that had been part of the land long before humans arrived. She said that the polar night was a time when the boundaries between the physical world and the spiritual world were thinner, and that sometimes people crossed over without meaning to. Over the next few days, I tried to put the experience out of my mind. I spent time with my cousins, learning about their lives, helping with chores, and exploring the village during the few hours of twilight we had each day. But I could not shake the feeling that something was wrong, that what had happened that night was real, not a dream or a hallucination. On our last night in the village, it happened again. I woke up in the middle of the night, and once again everyone was gone. This time I did not panic. I got dressed, and I went outside and I walked to the same spot at the edge of the village where I had seen the lights. And they were there again, the bright, pulsing orbs moving across the sky. I stood there, watching them, and I felt the same pull, the same urge to move toward them. But this time, I resisted. I turned around, and I walked back to the house, and when I got there, everyone was back, asleep in their beds, as if nothing had happened. The next morning, we flew back to Fairbanks. I did not tell my family about the second incident. I was afraid they would think I was losing my mind, or that they would dismiss it as another episode of sleepwalking. But I knew what I had experienced. I knew that I had lost time, that I had been somewhere I could not explain, and that the lights in the sky were connected to it somehow. When I got back to Fairbanks, I did some research. I looked into cases of missing time, of strange lights in the sky, of people who had experienced similar phenomena. I found stories from all over the world, but particularly from remote, isolated areas like northern Alaska. Some people attributed it to alien abductions, others to spiritual experiences, and still others to natural phenomena that we do not yet understand. I did not know what to believe, but I knew that whatever had happened to me was real. A few months later, I called my aunt, and I asked her about the family she had mentioned, the ones who had experienced missing time. She said they had moved to Anchorage, and that she had heard they still would not talk about what had happened. She also told me that there had been other incidents over the years, people in the village who had woken up with no memory of the previous night, people who had seen strange lights and heard voices calling to them from the darkness. She said the elders believed it was the spirits of the land testing people, seeing if they were strong enough to resist the pull. I asked her if she thought I had been tested, and she said she did not know. She said that the polar night was a powerful time, a time when the normal rules did not always apply, and that I should be grateful I had made it back both times. She said that not everyone did. I'm 21 now, and I have not been back to Anaktuvuk Pass. I think about those 2 nights often, about the missing time, about the lights in the sky, and about the strange pull I felt to move toward them. I have tried to rationalize it, to explain it away as stress or sleepwalking or some kind of psychological episode. But I know, deep in my heart, that it was something more. I know that during those hours I cannot account for, I was somewhere else, somewhere I was not supposed to be. And I know that if I had followed the lights, if I had given in to that pull, I might not have come back at all. My mother still dismisses it as a dream, and my brother says he does not remember anything unusual about the trip. But I know what I experienced, and I know that there are places in Alaska, particularly during the polar night, where the boundaries between our world and something else are thin. And I know that I am lucky to be here to tell this story, because not everyone who crosses over makes it back. The missing time, the empty village, the lights in the sky, They are all part of a mystery that I will probably never fully understand, but I will never forget it, and I will never stop wondering what really happened to me during those lost hours in the darkness of the Arctic winter.